Imagine you are standing on the greatest wall ever built. The moat below you is deep enough to drown an army. The garrison behind you numbers in the tens of thousands. Your city has never fallen. And then, across the horizon, you see them. Not hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. And for the first time in your life, you realize that walls don't save civilizations. People do. This is the story of the Jin Dynasty, one of the most powerful empires in East Asia, and how it was methodically, patiently, and completely destroyed by a man from the steppe who was told his entire life that cities like this were unconquerable. He proved them wrong, and the world was never the same. Stay until the end, because what ultimately killed the Jin Dynasty was not swords, not siege engines, and not even starvation. It was something far more devastating, and most people never see it coming. In 1215, the Mongol armies returned to the walls of Zhongdu. This time, there would be no negotiation. Zhongdu was not just a city, it was a statement. One of the most heavily fortified urban centers in all of East Asia. High walls, deep moats, a battle-hardened garrison. Everything a civilization could build to say, "You cannot break us." But the Mongols who arrived in 1215 were not the same force that had probed these walls before. They had learned. They brought siege engineers, captured experts from across conquered lands. They deployed catapults and traction trebuchets. Most critically, they understood something the Jin had not anticipated. You do not always have to break a wall. Sometimes, you simply have to wait. The Mongols blockaded the city, and then they starved it. Inside Zhongdu, conditions deteriorated with horrifying speed. Food ran out, disease spread through crowded streets. Historical accounts, written by survivors, describe cannibalism in the final months. The Jin defenders held as long as human endurance allowed. But starvation is merciless. It does not care about courage, or loyalty, or the thickness of your walls. Eventually, the walls were breached. The Mongols poured in. What happened next was catastrophic and deliberate. Zhongdu burned. Palaces were looted. Civilians were massacred. Historical accounts describe smoke darkening the sky for days, visible for miles in every direction. The capital of the Jin dynasty had fallen. But this was not merely a military defeat. It was psychological devastation on a civilizational scale. Northern China had lost its heart, its seat of power, its symbol of permanence, its proof that some things could not be touched. The Mongols had just proven something terrifying. Walls could fall, empires could burn, and if Zhongdu could burn, what couldn't? The fall of Zhongdu in 1215 fundamentally shifted the balance of power across East Asia. The Jin were not yet destroyed, but they were crippled in ways that would prove fatal. They had lost their northern stronghold, their political center, massive manpower, and, perhaps most critically, their prestige. In an era where power was as much about perception as armies, the loss of Zhongdu announced to every neighboring power, the Jin can be beaten. And for Genghis Khan, this victory taught him something invaluable. He could conquer fortified civilizations. He could besiege cities that were thought impregnable. He could be patient enough to starve out opponents who counted on their walls to outlast him. This single lesson would shape everything that followed. Without the fall of Zhongdu, there is no path to full Mongol dominance of northern China. And without that, the Yuan dynasty, the empire that would one day rule all of China, does not exist. But here's what most people miss about this moment of triumph. Victory came with a hidden cost. The Jin still controlled vast southern territories. They regrouped in Kaifeng. They were wounded, not dead. And Genghis Khan had other enemies on the horizon. In the years following Zhongdu's fall, the Mongol armies would turn west, against the Khwarezmian Empire, against Central Asia, against a world that had no idea what was coming. The war with the Jin would stretch on for 2 more decades. It would outlive Genghis himself, because when he died in 1227, the Jin dynasty, battered, diminished, hollow, still stood barely. After abandoning Zhongdu in 1214, the Jin court had relocated south to Kaifeng, and here's the detail that historians often gloss over, but that explains everything about why the Jin ultimately failed. The Jin had not always been city dwellers. They were founded by Jurchen horsemen, northern warriors of the steppe, people who valued mobility, aggression, and adaptability, people who conquered sedentary China because they were fast and ferocious. But somewhere along the way, they became what they had conquered. They built walls, they built palaces, they adopted imperial bureaucracy, they began to think like administrators rather than warriors. And when the Mongols arrived, people who were exactly what the Jurchen used to be, the Jin found themselves defending fortifications with an army that had forgotten how to do anything else. They had lost the northern military frontier, the loyalty of their steppe allies, vast manpower, and political prestige. Their enemies knew it. Their subjects felt it. The Mongols did not immediately launch a final annihilation campaign. That is not how they operated. Instead, they applied steady, relentless pressure, tightening their grip over northern China city by city, garrison by garrison. Cities surrendered. Regional warlords defected. The map of power shifted, not in dramatic battles, but in the slow, grinding erosion of Jin authority. And then Genghis Khan looked west. A new target had emerged. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the Islamic world. In 1219, the Mongol armies pivoted toward Central Asia. For a moment, the Jin exhaled. They had breathing room. But it was deceptive. This was not mercy. This was sequencing. The Mongols were not done with the Jin. They were simply attending to other business first. From 1219 to 1223, Genghis Khan's focus moved west with devastating effect. Samarkand fell. Bukhara burned. Entire civilizations that had stood for centuries collapsed within months. Meanwhile, the Jin attempted to use this window to rebuild. They strengthened Kaifeng's defenses. They reorganized their armies. They tried diplomacy with neighboring powers. But they faced a structural problem that no amount of wall building could solve. The Jin military system had been designed for frontier defense against a static threat. It was not built for long-term survival against a mobile empire that could appear from any direction, at any time, and choose exactly when to strike. And worse, the Jin were now geopolitically isolated. To the south lay the Song dynasty. For decades, the Jin and Song had been bitter enemies. The Jin had once conquered Song territory, humiliated their court, and forced tribute payments. The hatred ran deep, but power was shifting. A weakened Jin was not a threat, it was an opportunity. The Jin were now caught between two enemies, Mongols to the north, Song to the south. No allies, no room to maneuver. In geopolitics, as in war, that is a death sentence. Not always immediate, but inevitable. After devastating Central Asia, Genghis Khan returned east. But instead of striking the Jin immediately, he turned against the Tangut state, the Western Xia, a rebellious power that had once defied him. He wanted his western flank secured. He wanted no distractions when he finally moved to finish the Jin. In 1227, during that very campaign, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause remains debated. Battle wound, illness, a hunting accident. But what is certain is this: when the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen drew his final breath, the Jin dynasty still existed, wounded, shrinking, hollow, but alive. Leadership passed to Genghis Khan's son, Ögedei Khan. Ögedei was not his father, but he understood something with cold clarity that his father had not lived to complete. The Jin could not be left as a remnant state. A broken empire with a claim to legitimacy is still an empire. It would always be a threat. It would always be a rallying point. It had to be finished. In 1230, full-scale operations resumed. The final act of the Jin dynasty had begun. Mongol armies advanced from multiple directions simultaneously. This time, coordination was tighter than anything seen before. Generals like Subutai, arguably the greatest military mind of the era, executed deep flanking maneuvers that bypassed Jin strongholds entirely, cutting supply lines and retreat routes rather than assaulting walls directly. The Jin armies, already weakened by years of attrition, struggled to respond to threats that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Morale collapsed, resources ran thin, and then came the betrayal. The Mongols made contact with the Song dynasty, former enemies aligned against a common foe. The plan was devastatingly simple: destroy the Jin together. The Song would attack from the south, the Mongols would press from the north, and the Jin, the empire that had once crushed the Song, that had once humiliated their court and stolen their lands, would be ground to dust between two millstones. Geopolitically, this sealed the Jin's fate. There was no longer any scenario in which they survived. Kaifeng, the relocated Jin capital, became the final major bastion. The defenders knew what was coming. They fortified, they provisioned, they prepared to fight to the last. The Mongols laid siege. For months, brutal fighting raged in and around the city. And here is a detail that most people do not know. Something that makes this siege genuinely remarkable from a military history perspective. The Jin used gunpowder weapons against the besieging Mongol forces. Early bombs, fire lances, explosive projectiles that terrified horses and shattered formations. This was one of the earliest documented large-scale uses of gunpowder technology in siege warfare in human history. Innovation, it turned out, was not enough. Famine spread inside the walls. Disease followed famine. The Jin emperor fled the city, abandoning his own capital, his own people. Kaifeng fell. But the dynasty, somehow, did not yet die. It staggered onward, a ghost of itself, looking for somewhere to make a final stand. After Kaifeng's fall, the remaining Jin leadership fled south to Caizhou. Not a capital, not a fortress, not a center of power. A refuge, a hiding place, a place to die with some semblance of dignity. Mongol and Song forces were closing in from both sides. The Jin state had been reduced to rubble. Fragments of an empire that had once ruled 30 million people, now huddled in a single city with nowhere left to run. In early 1234, Mongol and Song armies besieged Caizhou together. Inside, supplies were gone. Hope was gone. The end was no longer a question of if, only when. The Jin emperor committed suicide after appointing his successor. He died in battle days later. The Jin dynasty was finished. After 119 years of rule, after conquering the north, humiliating the Song, and building one of the great empires of medieval Asia, it was gone. Here is the question worth sitting with. Why did it take so long? The Mongols were not cautious. They were not timid. They had destroyed empires in months. So why did the Jin survive for 23 years after the first invasion? Because the Jin were not weak. They were structured, urbanized, and defended by some of the most formidable fortifications in the medieval world. And because the Mongols, for all their genius, had to learn how to fight a different kind of war. In 1211, the Mongols were masters of the open battlefield. By 1234, they had become masters of siege warfare, multi-front coordination, and strategic patience, skills that changed the nature of warfare for centuries. The Jin were not defeated in a single collapse. They were dismantled, piece by piece. And now we arrive at the thing I mentioned at the beginning, the thing that actually killed the Jin dynasty, the thing that was not swords or siege engines or even starvation. It was success. The Jin had risen from the north as Jurchen horsemen, nomadic warriors who conquered sedentary China through speed, ferocity, and steppe adaptability. They were dangerous precisely because they were mobile, unpredictable, unbounded. And then they won. They conquered agricultural China. They built cities. They built walls. They adopted the imperial systems of the people they had conquered. They became administrators, bureaucrats, defenders of walls. They forgot what had made them dangerous. When the Mongols arrived, people who were exactly what the Jurchen used to be, the Jin found themselves defending fortifications with armies that had lost instincts that originally built the empire. Walls alone do not win wars. They never have. They buy time, and time only matters if you use it well. The Jin ran out of both. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more epic battles, great empires, and untold stories from history.